like to welcome Mr. Vijay Sankar sir, the chairman of Foundation of Data Protection Professionals in India. And the topic for today is accounting in the worlds of zeros and one. Sir is a registered independent director with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in Government of India. He has over 40 years of domain expertise, including banking, advertising, cyber law, education, information, and data security compliance. Sir has also authored a book titled Personal Data Protection Act of India PDPA 2020 to mark the beginning of a new era of data protection in India. Sir has also pioneered several academic thoughts such as theory of information security motivation and theory of data, etc. Now, Sir is working on developing a debate on how the classical cyber law thinking needs to be modified consequent to the emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. It's a pleasure having you here, sir. The platform is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Pranav, and good evening, friends. It's always a pleasure to interact with the technology community on something which is relevant to you as well as to me, who has been working in multiple areas for quite some time. Now, as we know that this topic which we are talking of today, which is connected with data valuation and accounting of data, that is what I am going to discuss. It's a new kind of discussion. Not very often you would have come across this discussion. But one thing I would like to say is that the concept is new, and we sometimes see when the concept is new, people don't want to think too much and come to a conclusion that something which is new is perhaps not yet say matured into an idea, and we wait for somebody from USA or somewhere else to tell us how data should be valued before we get into the system. I personally feel that we should actually be capable of taking the new concepts to the global world if it is necessary. That's why I like this quote, thinking is difficult, and that's why most people judge and try to say that we need to be different. So the discussions of today will therefore explore certain things which at the first instance you may find that it is not perhaps easily understood or acceptable, but hopefully over a period of time you will understand that this is how things will turn out in the global world. Pranav has already introduced me, so I will skip that. Now, in the time available to me, I am going to discuss, first of all, a brief introduction on different perspectives of data. Then we go into the concept of answering a question, does data have a value? And if so, what is the value of the data? And then finally, how do we bring visibility to data in the balance sheets of a company? Now, if we ask the question, what is a data? Obviously, different people have different concepts. Perspectives will differ. And as far as the technology community is concerned, we all know that data is a binary file, and that is something which we work on day in and day out. But this is not the only way data can be looked at. Actually, data can be looked at as a human experience, and that is where we come to have an interesting meaning for data. Of course, in the business, we look at data as money, and in the corporate circles, that also means that data is a business asset. And we also discuss whether data is a property. But with all these things, one thing which is certain is data appears to be an enigma. It's difficult to understand data because it appears that multiple perspectives exist simultaneously, and we need to actually look at the data as per the context in which we are looking at it. For example, why do we say binary is an experience? Is that you may have a binary file which to an uninitiated person is a jumble of zeros and ones. But we say data is in the beholder's eyes. So somebody who has a different perspective may look at the data as a text, or we may look at it as an image, and we actually experience the text or image, which is a representation of this binary on a monitor. Similarly, data can also get itself reproduced as a sound, and it can be heard, or a video that can be seen and heard, provided you have the monitor and the speaker. So what is data in binary form can appear as text or sound, and in future we may be able to get the sense of touch, sense of smell, and sense of taste, all of which can be simulated if you have the appropriate intermediary devices. If you have the right kind of devices, just as if you have a monitor, you can see. Likewise, if you have got perhaps a gloves which can take the signals, you can have a sense of touch. And just as you have a printer which can actually use multiple colored inks, we may tomorrow have a cartridge which can produce multiple types of smells, or maybe something which can also induce the taste. So depending upon the availability of appropriate intermediary devices, data can be in any form in terms of human experience. Now, which means that data per se has very little, you can say, use unless you have an appropriate application working on an appropriate system and an appropriate hardware. That is why we say data is dependent on so many things. So only because of this a human can see, hear, touch, or feel or smell data, or taste data. Tomorrow it may be possible to have a direct electromagnetic instructions going into the human brain, so that you may be able to even hallucinate data. So data can reproduce itself as a human experience in a multiple way, and this is the first thing we have to remember when we are talking of data. The other aspect of binary is that what we see as a binary in terms of human experience depends on an interpretation of the human being also. Apart from these devices and other things, there is a human interpretation also which goes into finding out what is a binary data. For example, if you have this particular string of zeros and ones, if you convert this binary into text using a converter which converts binary to ASCII, then perhaps you will get this kind of a sentence: data is in the beholder's eyes. So this binary actually means that it is a text having this kind of these 5-6 words. But the same data, if you put it through another converter, binary to decimal, then you may get a very long, actually, number which can be trillions of trillions or something like that. So the same is data is in the beholder's eyes, a text, or it may be this number, depending upon whether you are using the converter to ASCII characters or converter to a decimal value system. Now, somebody may say that you see here that some digits are there. In between, there are some gaps. And I will take a creative view that this is a number, there is a space, and this is a number. I can creatively interpret this data as a series of mathematical numbers, arithmetic numbers like 68, 97, 116, and so on. So when we look at data and call out that this data means so and so, it is something which is not an absolute truth. In fact, it is relative to one, the kind of devices we use to convert this binary into some human experience. Second, the person himself. For example, if this is a sentence, if I know English, I may be able to read this. If it is in Chinese, perhaps we will be looking at this as only some kind of a picture. So therefore, the human element along with the various devices, they actually give meaning to this data. So whatever we would like to do in terms of valuation, we must remember that the valuer is a human being and he actually uses various devices through which the data gets converted into some kind of an experience. In fact, Indian law has recognized this under our Information Technology Act. In fact, people sometimes don't recognize that we have in our law a section called Section 65B. It is actually in the Indian Evidence Act, but it was brought in because of the Information Technology Act, which talks about how we can give evidence in a court of law about a particular data file. So if somebody gives this file and asks me to stand before the court and say, please tell me what is this data, if I am the witness, I will say that I cannot give you a sort of yes or no. If somebody is cross-examining me and the lawyer says, please give me either yes or no, I will say we cannot give an yes or no answer if we are interpreting a data, because if you look at it in one device, it may look like a sentence. In another, it may look like a number. Who knows that this may be actually a code word for a Swiss bank account, or it is a code word for some terrorist activity. We do not know. So that is what has been recognized under Section 65B of Indian Evidence Act, which says that no data, no electronic document is accepted as evidence in a court of law unless a human being certifies that if I use this particular software, this is what it means. So his evidence is dependent on the method by which he views a particular binary data. So this is something which we have to keep in the back of our mind, that data is in the beholder's eyes. Now people say data is property because data can be owned, it can be transferred from one person to another person, and we can even fix some consideration, so many rupees for transfer or something like that. In fact, data which is in the form of say something like a Bitcoin may have value in several lakhs of rupees. So data can be looked at as a property also. Now, why do we say data is money? Because we all have heard that if any product is free, then you are the product, because data itself is having some value which can be monetized by the receiver of the data. In fact, the software is also a data, and we know that software can be sold, and so data can be sold like that. And in fact, there is also a dollar store in UK, as we understand, where personal data can also be exchanged for goods. Now, data can also be consumed instead of being sold for generating money through other assets. Sometimes a software or any other data can be transferred under a license, like let us say even a video on a OTT platform. So data can be monetized in a number of ways, and that is why we say data is money. When we look at data as an asset, we have to look at two aspects. One is, in industry, we sometimes have heard of two kinds of assets. One is called the fixed assets, another is called the current assets. Now, what is a fixed asset? We have got a machine which if you switch on, it keeps on working, and if you feed it with some consumables, it produces some goods. While it produces the goods which are ultimately sold, this machine remains as it is, except for the wear and tear. So these are kinds of assets which remain as they are, but it creates value to its owner by converting something called a raw material into a finished goods. As against this, current assets are those assets which actually transform themselves from one state like a raw material to a work in progress and finished goods. Now, data also can work like this, both as similar to a fixed asset where data remains, it does not change, but it produces revenue to the owner. That's one kind of data. We'll give an example of that later. Then second is data can undergo transformation by itself and keep on adding value, which is like the current asset. So data is an asset. It can be considered a fixed asset, kind of commodity. It can also be considered like a current asset kind of commodity. Now, in terms of accounting, sometimes accountants classify data into what we call as tangible assets and intangible assets. Tangible assets are those which have got physical existence, which includes land, building, machineries, etc. Even your raw material and other things, basically those which have got a physical existence. Now, there are other assets which are not physically present, and accountants consider them as what we is referred to as intangible assets. Examples of intangible assets could be goodwill. It could be IPR related assets like trademark, copyright, patent right. There is also a term which we use called actionable claim. That is, sometimes there are certain claims which may be made because of a contract arising of some contingent event. For example, an insurance policy is like that. Insurance policy matures into money, let us say after expiry of 20 years, 25 years. So these are called actionable claims. That is, assets which can be converted into cash upon the happening of a certain contingent event. So intangible assets are any of these types, and there is an accounting standard for how to value intangible assets. Sometimes some of the traditional accountants say that we should recognize intangible assets only if it has been bought from outside for cash, but if it is created within the organization, then it is not reliable enough to be brought into the balance sheet. So there are various accounting systems there, but there is a standard. Just as there is an accounting standard for fixed assets, how to have depreciation, how to value it, how to show it in the balance sheet as cost less depreciation, and there are certain assets which we actually revalue and show at various points of time. So there is some standard for intangible assets. But unfortunately, our data as an asset does not fall into strictly any of these known asset categories. Like fixed, it has got the characteristics of a fixed asset, but it is not a fixed asset. It has got characteristics of a current asset, but it is not a current asset. It is having characteristics of intangible assets, but it is not an intangible asset. Because one of the major differences between all other kinds of assets and data as an asset is that data is replicable. In every other case, a raw material is converted into finished goods and it is sold. When it is sold, the seller does not continue its possession. The buyer gets the possession. So one particular piece of product can be produced and then sold from one person to another person. And then instant, you can say the possession of that by the manufacturer seller. In the case of data, it is not like that. If you have produced a data asset, then you can sell it to multiple persons and that selling does not affect your possession, which means that you can have multiple instances of data assets which are sold and their you don't have any other easily comparable asset class for which accountants have developed various, you can say, standards. So, and another thing is sometimes the data asset can be used simultaneously by multiple users. Look at a platform. If you look at a platform, a cloud platform as an asset, then simultaneously thousands of persons may be using it. So I have this platform as an asset, like a fixed asset. I own that platform and I generate revenue over a period of time, just like a machine churns out revenue. But in this case, I don't need to sell it to say one industry because simultaneously my platform may be used by multiple persons. So therefore, this is another very important aspect of data asset. But if you want, you can always create an exclusive licensing system or even absolute transmission of rights. So it is at your option that you can consider data asset either as similar to a fixed asset or current assets, but treat, if you want, as a different class of data asset. Another important aspect of data as an asset is in the case of a manufactured physical, you can say finished goods, a raw material can be converted into finished goods, but once it is in finished goods form, you cannot reconvert it into a raw material. But look at data. You have data, you can add value to it and make it a value added data. Then if you want, you can keep on removing the data elements and bring it back to the raw material. So a raw data can become a finished data and finished data can be converted back into the raw data. Because of these characteristics of replicability and this two-way movement of data, you cannot consider data as any kind of known assets, and that is why we say data is an enigma. We have to find out a new way of looking at data, and therefore when we want to value the data, we need a totally different approach to understanding the data itself. That is why we need a theory of data to explain what data means to different stakeholders. Now, I have been discussing something called the theory of data built on three hypotheses called definition hypothesis, life cycle hypothesis, and ownership of data, these three elements. Very briefly to talk about that, the definition hypothesis is data is in the beholder's eyes. Don't tell me that you have a CD and data is in the CD. Say that data is not in the CD. Data is not even in the zeros and the ones. It is in the eyes of the human being who interprets the data, as I told you, with appropriate devices and his own knowledge. So that is the first hypothesis on which we need to understand data. Second is data has a life cycle. It starts from what I call as a data dust. What I mean by data dust is you have data spread over in a random and a chaotic manner on a series zeros and ones spread over, no meaning to that. If you put it in any computer, nothing meaningful can come up. So that is the data dust. From there, you start organizing the data. It becomes a byte and you put different bytes together in a sequence. It acquires some meaning, and like that, the value of data gets added and it becomes personal data, it becomes identifiable data, it can become de-identified data and so on. And this is what is reversible. So this is the reversible life cycle hypothesis of data. The last thing which is also relevant for us for valuation is the ownership of data and the value additions happen with multiple people. For example, you give me a name, then I actually add, let us say, health data. I'm a doctor, or let us say I am the pharmacy, or let us say I'm a hospital. You come for diagnosis. You come with your own data, your name, address, etc. Then I conduct certain tests and I add the health data. Now the data which the hospital has got, personal identity data and health data. Now the question is, who is the owner of this data? Is both together owned by the data subject, or should we recognize that The first set of data belongs to the owner, that is data subject. The second set of the data is created by the hospital and it has got a right over that. Of course, it can always transfer the right to the data subject. So as the processing of a data happens and the data changes its avatars at different points of time, maybe different stakeholders are involved, and therefore the valuation of data, which is the end product, may be actually belonging to multiple people. It is like in the case of let us say a poet who writes a poem which is converted into a film song. In between, you have got people who put tunes, who actually record it, and then finally the producer who takes over the right. So these 4 or 5 people who add value at different points of time, Copyright Act recognizes the ownership differently at each stage, unless that particular person transfers the right to the next person. We may have simultaneously the author who keeps his right with him, the person who puts the tune, he has got his own right, the film producer has got his own right. But normally the industry, each progressive level, the person buys the data of the previous person in the form of a licensing. So ultimately it becomes the right on the song which the producer of a movie may perhaps own. But intellectual property right recognizes that at each stage different people add value, and that is recognized as the valuation. Same way, in data processing, when we change the status of data from raw data to various kinds of data, there are different value adders who has to be recognized for their contribution. Now, this is the concept under which we are now going to discuss how do we discover the value of data. Now, before we go further, I want you to make a distinction that when we say valuation, valuation of a data asset is different from valuation of a data enterprise. Now, recently we had this Zomato public issue, and people have been talking about $1 billion say valuation for Zomato or something like that. There is something called market capitalization. Some people look at the share value and say so many number of shares are there in Zomato, multiply it by 130 rupees, which is the share value, and therefore the value of Zomato as an enterprise is so much. So this is called enterprise valuation. Now, data asset valuation is different. It is like, suppose there is an industry which has got 100 cars as their assets. Now, if you total up the value of 100 cars, to some extent you get a value of the enterprise. But the value of enterprise may come through various other assets also. So one is through individually identifying the value of the assets and then aggregating it. That is one way of getting the valuation of the enterprise. But there is another way by which we actually value an enterprise, which is called a discounted net present value of future earnings and further capitalization. What we mean by this is a company has got assets not for just showcasing it in its showroom. We have an asset because we want to use that asset and convert it into revenue. So if I have got some assets today, over the next 10 years, each year I have some income. Now that income, if you bring it down to what is the value as of today, that is called the net present value. Then we look at the total net present value of the assets based on the future value generation capability, and then say that, okay, this is the revenue generation capacity. Now, if I put it in something like a bank deposit, I would have got, say, 5% return, which means that for every rupee of interest I earn, I have got 20 times that as bank deposit. This is called market capitalization of the earnings. So likewise, once we find out what is the total revenue generated by the assets, we further extend it, multiply it by a factor and say this is the value of the enterprise. That is one of the ways by which enterprise valuation is done. Now, if we want to attempt now the valuation of data in an organization, we need to therefore look at what kind of data assets are there and then add the various data. Now, in data, we normally use the term personal data and non-personal data. These are two major categories because in terms of valuation, there is a lot of difference between valuing a personal data and valuing a non-personal data. Now, for example, a personal data set itself consists of a combination of identity data, then some kind of associated data like the health data, finance data. There are the views and beliefs of the person, which we know that they are all considered sensitive personal information under the laws. Then there is something which we call as a profile. The profile is a sort of a prediction that this particular person will behave in a particular manner. Now that is also called part of the personal data. In fact, why Zomato is valued is because we feel that Zomato has got so many clients. It has an understanding of the eating habits of millions of people. And with that information, it can convert that into some big data analytics and thereby develop the business in a particular way, like what we call as a cloud kitchen and so on. So the profiling becomes a major value determinant. So therefore, when we want to value personal data, the first thing is we should be able to classify that into these different sub parameters: identity, which is name, address, etc., then associated data, then views and beliefs, and then profiles. Now, non-personal data also may have multiple characteristics. Now, personal data can also become non-personal data if there is an anonymization, filtering, which removes the identity in such a manner that it cannot be reclaimed. Okay, we talk of de-identification, which is different, pseudonymization, which is different, whereas anonymization is transfer of personal data into such form that even if you want, you cannot get back the original identified personal data. It's an irreversible process. Now, apart from that converted personal data, non-personal data also arises directly like the corporate data. It may come because of the community data. For example, if you look at a Google map, say 1,000 people are moving in this particular road at a particular point of time, that is something like a community data. Then there can be transaction data, that is what Amazons and others will do, that it has got the data between the company and then the individual. There is data about the weather and other environmental data. Some data we may recognize as belonging to the government. Then there is something called the general views and the news, which is different from the individual views and beliefs. This is personal data, whereas what comes in Times of India is news. And it is actually an aggregation of the views of various reporters. So non-personal data has got journalistic data, etc. So if you want to value the data assets of an organization, first of all, you should look at finding out personal data, non-personal data, then identify how the personal data elements are there and what are the non-personal data elements are there. This recognition of data categories is the first step. Then we look at the basis of data valuation. Now, here we have got, I told you this, how much revenue it can earn over a foreseeable future and bringing it down to net present value. This is one way by which valuations are done by the valuers. But more easily understood thing is, what is the cost of the asset or what is the current market value? That is one of the basic factors. Now, if I have produced some goods and I have spent 100 rupees on that, I can sell it at say 120 rupees. Then 120 rupees is the market value, 100 rupees is the cost price. Accountants normally take cost or market price, whichever is less. This is called conservative valuation. In the case of fixed assets, we take the cost and then year by year we account some wear and tear and call that as depreciation. That is the way we try to price it. So this is the basis of valuation of all assets. It can also be done for data. So if a company has got, say, 1 million data sets of persons, then for acquiring that, it has actually spent some money. It has taken 2-3 years perhaps, or they have actually bought it off, whatever way, there is a cost. The cost of acquisition or creation is one of the parameters which has to be taken, and the market value, if it is sold today, which is relevant in the case of this mergers, acquisitions kind of a thing, is also something which can be used, and as a conservative model, whichever is less can be uh, taken. Revaluation is done in certain cases. For example, you look at a company which is having gems and jewelry. Now for them, they have to periodically revalue the assets. So cost, market value is, both are considered, and sometimes revaluation is also a standard practice. The same basis can be used for data valuation also. So valuation of data, you find out the value of personal data, value of non-personal data, and combine that with some kind of a parameter like cost, market value, etc. This is one part of the valuation. Then subsequently, what you have to do is, what is the volume of such data? Volume means number of data sets, and then look at either the unit value, or if you can put at the total value together, you arrive at the total value of personal data and non-personal data available with the organization. Then we try to further refine this data with some additional valuation parameters, because data valuation differs depending upon, as I told you, the different avatars of the data. One way by which we look at that is, we look at the depth and sensitivity of the data. For example, if I have got only name and address, that is level 1, let us say. But suppose I have got the bank account number, credit card number, that is level 2. If I have got health data, if I have got credit rating, then that data, you are going into deeper and deeper sets. So depending upon the depth and sensitivity, obviously you have to add some weightages for the volume. So if there is an intrinsic value of the total data, it can get further refined by the premium on depth and sensitivity, premium on reliability. The reliability means that whether the data can be considered, say, good for decision making. That is where in personal data we say you have to get a KYC done, you have to get confirmation from another third party source. All these things will add to the reliability. So if I simply have the unverified data versus verified data will be more valuable. So that factor is what we can look at as reliability. Then usability. Sometimes the data is licensed. I can use it only for certain purposes. Say for 1 year I can use it, next year I cannot use it. So usability also is a parameter. So in terms of valuing of personal data, generally this is how we proceed with the valuation. Depth and sensitivity, which is from name, gender, address to other aspects, leading on to the political beliefs, religious beliefs, and profiling. Reliability, as gathered, as confirmed, or by a third party source like a government authority. Then usability, whether it is identified data, when it is de-identified, maybe it may be useful for some other purposes. Corporate data with IPR value, without IPR values. So all these parameters will determine the valuation of data. Now, as valuers, I am trying to say that as technology people, tomorrow you will be either valuing the data yourself, or perhaps you will be assisting the other valuers. We must know that there are different ways by which data is generally valued. So we have to find the appropriate method by which we can value our data. We all know that data sets like a domain name may have their own value. In fact, there's a market value for cyberfrat.com, $1,057. This is supposed to be a market value. Now, obviously, this has not come into the accounting books of cyberfrat. So, which means that you are ignoring a $1,000 asset which you have got. Remember that this valuation may keep on differing based on the type of domain name, whether the TLD extension is .in or .org or .com, and in certain cases like Canara Bank, $7,000 is current market value of the domain name. So they are substantial, it cannot be ignored. But very recently we had an instance in India where a company had possessed uh, the clients whose business was worth more than 100, 200 crores, but that company was declared insolvent because the valuers could not understand data and data business. They were actually blind to the data assets. This is one of the things which we want to avoid. Now, you look at platforms like Twitter. Now, here, what is happening is Twitter keeps on adding, say, tweets contributed by various people, and that creates a reservoir of certain data. And based on that, the company earns advertising revenue. So this is a different kind of valuation system which you have to use there. And even here, say tweet which is recent may have more value, tweet which is 2-3 years old may have lesser value, but even tweets of 5 years, 6 years old may still have a value because of the sudden development of new things. For example, some XYZ becomes the minister today, then his tweets of 3 years back, 4 years back get value. So there are these platforms like Twitter who actually keep on accumulating the data, and that creates an earning potential. Here, the valuation has to be based on the earning potential. That is one of the ways by which you can value such platforms. You have all heard about cryptocurrencies. Now, cryptocurrencies have got both the cost of production as well as the market value, which is a perception for various reasons. So there is a value perception based on the cryptocurrency, which is nothing but a small data file. Similarly, in the IPR scenario, trademark, copyright, patent, they all have value, and there is an established system for valuation. For example, if you look at a trademark, one particular, say, ciprofloxacin tablet, if it is in generic form, its value is 11 rupees, but if it is a branded product, it becomes 55 rupees, which means this 44 rupees comes out of the trademark value created by the branding. So we take that as the valuation. So valuers have a method by which the IPR related assets can be valued. This is something which is established. And in the case of copyright and patent, there are licensing fees fixed on that basis. There are separate accounting standards for this. There is no ambiguity as far as this is concerned. Now look at the problem with the data companies. Data companies, because they don't value the data, sometimes mergers, acquisitions happen at ridiculously, you can say, low rates. For example, look at a company called Sibyl, which in 2001 had a particular shareholding pattern. In 2014, TransUnion, which had 10% shares here, had a valuation of 92%, which means it bought 82% of the shares of Sibyl from different banks in India. Now, what is the value of this Sibyl? Sibyl, which is today called TransUnion Sibyl, is a listed company in the New York Stock Exchange, and it is traded around $112. But what is important is Sibyl has a value, control of sensitive personal data of 100 crore Indians. Now this 100 crore Indians sensitive personal data, which is name, address, credit card details, profiling of how the credit card spending is done, etc., etc. All that is now transferred to TransUnion as a 92% shareholder, and nobody ever realized what was the value. In fact, if you value this on the basis of what is happening in the market, it would come to some several lakh crores. How do we value this? Because dark web has got a price index for credit card data and other data, which is a standard system, where in fact like a menu item it is available. If you use some of these kind of valuation basis, the valuation of this civil comes to around 7 lakh crores, and all our bankers were blind to this cost, and perhaps they must have transferred it at face value. Same way, Zomato is today able to sell its company to the shareholders by creating a certain data value perception. It is a kind of imaginary valuation. But remember that as long as there are people who are willing to pay, like if I say Bitcoin has got zero value, if you say somebody else is willing to buy at 5 lakhs or 6 lakhs, it is a realistic value. Okay. Similarly, Zomato, some traditional investment bankers may say it is not worth 70 rupees, 76 rupees at which it was sold, but it was listed at 125 rupees. So there are people who are buying. In fact, there are two recent incidents. Recent means 1 year old incidents. United Airlines and American Airlines, two airlines companies in USA, both had problems because of the COVID, reduction of travel and other things. What they did was they had the customer loyalty programs like our frequent flyer programs, and they valued that data. One of the companies, that is the United Airlines, got a valuation of 20 billion US dollars. American Airlines got a valuation of between 19.5 to 31.5 billion US dollars. Thereby, the companies were able to say that they were much more valuable than what was the value of, say, the number of airplanes they must be having or assets they must be having. In fact, you all know that Air India is now in merger equations. Maybe if they also look at this kind of valuation, the valuation of Air India will be quite high. In fact, Air India suffered a data breach, and in fact, the hackers placed a certain value. Even if you take that hackers value, I think there was about 5,000 crores of valuation of the data, which obviously was not and is still perhaps not in the books of Air India. So when it sells itself out, this 5,000 crores is like a hidden asset. In fact, in USA, one of the companies called Caesar Entertainment operating company actually was in the bankruptcy proceedings. At that time, they were able to cash in on the customer loyalty database and realize more than $1 billion. In fact, it has become now a common practice in USA not only to value the data at this $1 billion valuation, but also collateralize that and raise finance. In India, we are still not able to do this because we have not understood this value of data. In fact, Vodafone, which is having a problem now in terms of the spectrum money which it is due to pay, has 20 crore customers. Now, each of these customers have got outgoing calls, number of outgoing calls to different people. Now, if Zomato can take information about the ordering, that order also goes through Vodafone messaging system. So whatever value Zomato claims as the customer profiling base is already available with Vodafone, and it is not only the name, address, etc., profile of usage, but remember that for every call you make, there will be 10 people who will be making incoming calls to you. That also gives rise to some kind of a data. This, along with innumerable number of SMS messages, banking habits, shopping habits, credit card usage habits, they are all there with Vodafone. So if there is a good data scientist and a big data company which realizes this, the valuation of Vodafone can be several hundred times perhaps that of Zomato. but the shares of Vodafone is languishing today at 6 rupees or 7 rupees, whereas Zomato is sold at 76 rupees. That is where the lack of ability of people to realize the value of data and bring it to the balance sheet is killing some of these companies. So it is the responsibility of all professionals to bring visibility to the value of data to the management by bringing this valuation into the balance sheet, taking into account that data goes through a process and at different stages the valuation is different. You must, like a work in progress, it happens in raw materials also. It can be value. If this value is brought in, then we will have a proper visibility of data. In fact, in our Personal Data Protection Standard of India, PDPSI, which is the standard for data protection related uh, audits, we have included the need to bring visibility of data into the balance sheet, because without that, an organization does not know what is the value of data which it is protecting. So that is not considered the right thing. The management should know how much of data it has got. Therefore, we have suggested this as part of the standard. As I told you, computation can be done in a different way. Uh, Maybe there could be scope for further innovation in this. I have presented one particular method by which you can calculate the intrinsic value and use some multiplication factors. So there is a system there. But what we are discussing now is how to bring this data valuation into a visible mode. Like how do we put it in the balance sheet? Now, those of you who are aware of financial accounting, you know that we bring certain values as a class of asset or liability, and then sometimes we put it as a contra item at both ends, and sometimes below the line we also provide it. So any of these methods can be used, but a balance sheet must have visibility of the data is one of the suggestions which we are trying to put it across to the professionals. And as technology people, please remember that if you are a person who is asking for budget from your management, if the management knows that you are a CISO managing 100 crore worth of personal data or DPO, then they will know how much they have to invest on you. So that is one of the advantages. Management will know mergers and acquisitions, the things like TransUnion civil problems will not arise. Shareholders will not get cheated, and there will be no surprise of a sudden data breach when the uh, hacker is asking you 5 crores, 10 crores. Management will come around and say, I never knew that I had 5 crores worth of data. So that kind of surprises can be prevented. So this is the beauty of this valuation system of data. Future is unknown, but there is no doubt that the future could be fascinating and rewarding if we get ready. So far, we have been discussing technologies to enhance their career prospects by getting to know something about data protection and become DPOs. Now I have to say, please look at this additional one more career is coming up as data valuers. If you know something about valuation, as a technology person, you have got a good understanding of data, then perhaps you will also open up some career in the data valuation. So friends, this is what I wanted to share with you. If there is time for you to raise any questions, I will be happy to answer those questions. Okay?
Sure, sir. Thank you for this amazing session on data valuation. I guess it has really helped attendees know a lot. And we are up for a Q&A session. So if you have any queries, you can put it in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand so you can have a one-on-one conversation with sir. So it's all praises for you in the chat right now. Amazing session by sir.
Yeah, it's a new
Right.
topic, so I had to go a little fast and I consumed the 10-15 minutes you had kept for questioning. But still, I will be happy if any questions are there.
Okay. So Mr. Devendra is asking, how does one keep with the valuation of constantly changing data?
See, in fact, our balance sheet system itself is a snapshot system, we say. Now, when we say that the asset is valued at so and so on the date of the balance sheet, it means that next day it may be different. Is it not? So we have, in fact, even if you take auditors, when we audit a company, it is at the time of my audit, I have a valuation, I have a view. So same way, you have to actually freeze the activities on an imaginary date and then say, at this point of time, part of my data is raw data, part of my data is sensitive data, part of my data is XYZ, and I have different valuations for that. So you have to put a snapshot of the data as an asset, which is a common thing which is done in a normal balance sheet also, and then look at what I suggested as valuation. Okay.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful answer. So we have Guru Prasad JMR who is raising his hand. So you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sir, thank you, sir. Naavi sir, first of all, thank you so much, sir. It's a great privilege. I heard and read a lot of things about you, sir. I'm really thrilled. I don't have words to express, sir. Really, thanks a lot. And you are the almost, I can say, not one of you are the greatest person in India in terms of data and privacy, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable time, sir. Just I have only one question, sir. As you mentioned about the data as a valuation in one liner, data is future. Whoever takes it in that career, that should be fine. Sir, I am into technology of cyber security. What is the currently last 5 years we saw DPO roles, sir. But now, as you mentioned, evaluation and all. So if we take what learning route to come into this field or how to cherish it kind of thing, if you, and that is one question, sir. Second one is, I heard a lot about your DPO course in Naavi, sir, Naavi and the FTDPI other website. So if you want to avail that, if you can throw some light, definitely that will help, sir. And once again, I'm cherished, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks a lot, sir.
Okay. Now, I will very briefly say about this courses. So you can go to ftppi.in and you will get the details. We have got a course which actually gives you the legal knowledge. That is legal knowledge about Indian data protection laws, legal knowledge about global data protection laws, and then the audit perspectives. So it's a comprehensive program. In fact, I don't want to go more into that, I think. But coming to your other this thing that we were talking of technology people becoming DPOs, and I was telling that DPO is more valuable role and he may sit above the CISO kind of a thing. So it's a career because the DPO represents technology knowledge plus something else, which is the knowledge of data protection laws. Now we are talking of another dimension. Now to value the data, you need to know about what is data. So that is the technology aspect. You need to know about the DPO kind of knowledge because, as I told you, data valuation differs from whether it's a sensitive data or a non-sensitive data, and whether you have taken the consent for use of data for 6 months, 1 year, or single use. So knowledge of data protection restrictions. For example, if you have taken, for example, we are talking of Zomato. Zomato has taken my consent for supply of food to my house. Now, have I given consent for them to sell this data to somebody else? I have not given. So that restriction is what only a data protection person can understand. Otherwise, 1 year from now, when a data protection authority is there, if somebody files a case against Zomato, where did you have the consent to use this particular data? They will have no answer and they will be having a liability to face. So this data value here should have a reasonable understanding of data protection laws because it affects the data valuation. And tomorrow we are coming up with another law called Data Governance, Non-Personal Data Governance Act, which the government is working on, where non-personal data can be sold. Now, the knowledge of these things is essential, plus accountant's mindset is required. I talk about this because in the early part of my career, I was a merchant banker, investment banker. We were actually valuing public issues, IPOs. Now, those things, of course, you cannot acquire everything overnight, maybe ultimately a data valuation will be a team effort, but if you are looking at a career, you will need technology information or knowledge, legal knowledge, not to the extent of going to the court, data protection law knowledge, and valuation kind of knowledge, like what is a fixed asset and other things. Then you will be able to work on this data valuation field. It will be actually a premium kind of a profession. Okay.
Sure. Thank you,
Yeah.
sir. Thank
Thank you,
question.
sir. We now have Rakesh EP.
Yeah.
Rakesh, you can unmute yourself and okay, so I think we have lost connection. Uh, so yes, sir. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, yeah. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So we have one question that you spoke about Air India and Vodafone having data which could be monetized. However, customer data doesn't belong to them. They are only the custodians and they can use that only for explicit purpose of providing that intended services. So any views on this, sir?
I agree. I agree. That is why I said data protection knowledge is necessary for valuation. And if you understand that this is not free data which you can use, you know what is the limitation. But if you have taken the appropriate consent, okay, then you have the usage of that data. You understand? So to start this data valuation will come only if you are holding appropriate consent. So the person who drafts the notice and consent form actually determines what is the valuation which will be taken later on. So that is where I say that data protection related knowledge is essential. If you don't have it, for example, personal data has to be renewed every year according to the Data Protection Act, okay, when it comes. So if you don't have that renewal of the consent, then your last year's consent will bring that value to zero. That is, personal data which was having X value becomes zero if consent is not renewed. So the valuer should be aware of this and he cannot blindly value the data year after year without taking into knowledge whether I have got consent for whether it was a one-time consent or multiple consents, whether it is extended after a period of 1 year. So if you take that into consideration, then you can bring value. If American Airlines and United Airlines have been able to do that, and US-based, say, bankruptcy courts have accepted this valuation. I understand banks have even financed against that. There also the same data protection requirements are there. So it all depends on the consent. Now, if Vodafone asks the consent of its 20 crore people saying that I am going bankrupt, please help me by giving your consent for which you don't have to pay any money. And most of you think that anyway I am using that information without your consent also. So like WhatsApp asking for consent, Vodafone if it asks for consent, the majority of the people will take yes, okay. And once you have that consent, then the valuer can actually add value. If the valuer doesn't know data protection laws and if he values, then like what I said now, Zomato, I'm questioning whether they have got the power to monetize that. That is because Zomato has not so far taken the consent for monetization. So that question will come. But if the valuer knows data protection regulations, he will ensure that he will get a consent. So if I am in Vodafone today, first thing I will do is I will ask 20 crore persons to give me consent. Once I am armed with that consent, even if only 50% of them give me the consent, that 10 crore consent-based personal information of the entire set, it is valuable. And if I float a tender, I think data company, these big data companies will be able to say really how much of value is there. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So he's just asking that isn't it misusing the customer data? Like, isn't that actually misusing of customer data?
No, it will become a misuse if you don't have consent. That's what I'm saying. If you take consent, then it becomes proper use. Okay, so personal data is restricted, so it has to be fortified with consent. Otherwise, it becomes misuse. But anonymized data, most of these data, big data companies don't want to know whether it is my data or your data. They want only anonymized data. They want a general profile, a male of the age 30 to 40, how much phone he is using. That doesn't require much of the consent. Okay, anonymized data can be easily monetized. Only when you want to take personalized, identified data, you have the consent as your, hurdle. Okay.
So next we have a question from Vishal Sharma. So you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Very good evening, sir.
Well,
Thank you so much for enlightening all of us with such useful information. Sir, when you say that these companies collecting data and if they don't have the customer consent, then it may be considered as a misuse of the personal information. How would you characterize this situation wherein people who log in into Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these sort of social platforms, when they log in and sign up, doesn't it is considered as a consent for using the information?
no, actually there will be a notice and actually tick something to say that we agree. And this, according to the laws, the notice has to be clear. It should be easily explained. Then person should understand that. And it can be general consent or let's say explicit consent. That is, if for non-sensitive personal data, you can have a general consent of multiple things and then get one tick. But if the sensitive information is collected, then there has to be an explicit consent. Okay. Now, Facebook may be having it in their form. Only thing is they are so bulky that you may not have checked that. But in fact, that is the reason why Facebook has today provisioned 313 million US dollars as potential fine it may face under GDPR. These are cases which they are anticipating. So they know that they have to pay 313 million fine. India, we don't have a data protection law, so they can do whatever they want. But not getting a proper consent and not giving a proper notice could actually undermine the ability of Facebook or Google to actually use that data. But you have seen why WhatsApp wanted a new consent was they wanted to somehow try to come within the provisions of general data protection regulations. So they will all do that, and whether what they have done is adequate or not adequate will be a matter which will be questioned with the data protection authority. In fact, Google paid 50 million US dollars. One of the reasons was that their consent was so complicated that a person has to look through 2-3 different links to really understand how my data is being used. And the court said that it is so complicated that people will not get proper idea, therefore it is deficient. The notice is deficient. So those things will happen when India has got its own data protection authority. But what I'm saying is, business, if they know this restriction, instead of bypassing this restriction and trying to cheat the public, they should openly come up with a consent request saying that I want to use your personal data, I want to make money, and perhaps I will give you a share of that money in some form, and take consent. Then only the valuation will be valid. Otherwise, it will be misused and there will be a counter liability coming out of that. That is why sometimes holding personal data is actually like holding this, you can say, explosives in your inventory kind of a thing, okay? Or so some of the assets which you have to put in some special efforts to secure. It is not like if you have got a steel rod, you can throw it in the open ground. But if you are having some explosive chemicals, you have to put it in a proper place, temperature and other things you have to see. Likewise, personal data has to be handled with care. Okay, so but if you handle it with care, then there is value attached with that. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful answer. So one last question for the day. So how did Jio monetize Jio platforms for its data and raise a lot of money, whereas Vodafone India was not able to do the same?
Jio had better advisors, I suppose. Okay, they were able to convince Facebook to invest. Obviously, they have valued it. Vodafone can do it even now. Only thing is, today Vodafone is almost close to bankruptcy. Okay, so that creates little more difficulty in getting the trust. But they have the data. There is no doubt that it is not like a company which starts from tomorrow. If I open a ISP tomorrow, I have to get my first telephone consumer. I mean, okay, whereas Vodafone has people. It is like you, like in cricket, we say that you play first and put your score on the board, then the person who is chasing has got that scoreboard pressure. Likewise, this Vodafone has got 20 crore customers and billions of transactions. And from that transaction, you can extract information if you know what to look for. As I told you, in my phone call, I have got SMS from my bank. I've got my Amazon payment and other things. So if somebody wants to profile from a phone details, they know whether I am a frequent buyer in Amazon, whether I am a frequent banking online banking customer, or whether I just chat with people for hours together. Whether see all this profiling can come whether I am a serious consumer or some like college people who talk for hours, some college students, boy and a girl. There is no value in that as far as a data company is concerned, unless I'm selling them a mobile or something like that. So there is a profiling possibility from out of that information which is invaluable. Okay, provided you have got the eye. That is why data is in the beholder's eyes.
So really, thanks a lot, sir. Today's session was really very interesting, and there's all praises in the chat box as well. Uh, so on behalf of entire Cyberfrat team, we would like to thank you for taking your time to speak on such interesting topic. I still think data valuation has some time to come to India, and well, we are looking forward for many such interesting sessions with you. And really, once again, I'd like to thank you for addressing all the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Hoping to see you next Thursday as well. So good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.